So I think Beria was, I think Beria was, I think he endured being with Beria, but I think he also probably played along because he understood that it was important to his survival to play along and to be in Beria's corner, to essentially cultivate Beria's favor. And strangely enough, when I said what happened after Stalin died, my grandfather said, "Well, I was ordered to be a guard in a labor camp, in a prison camp in Siberia." Now, of course, after Stalin dies, all of the guards, all of the bodyguards associated with him are either arrested, shot, or sent to work in the Gulag. In Nadezhda Alueva's memoir, this is Stalin's daughter. Svetlana Alueva's memoir. Nadezhda was her mother. She writes that when it is announced that Stalin has died, two of the bodyguards kill themselves because they, I think, understand what's coming. And I think there's a wide perception that there would be a purge, and in fact there was. And I said, well, so why didn't you end up working in this labor camp? And he said, well, my grandfather says, I went to Beria and I asked him to amend that order. And I asked him to send me back to my hometown in Ukraine so I could take care of my elderly parents, which is in fact what happened, because that's where my father was 5 at the time, and he packed him and his family aboard a train and they went to Ukraine. They had 1 day to leave. They had to literally leave in 24 hours. So we know that this happened. And I said, well, how did you get a conversation with the most powerful man in the country, which at that point Beria was, and how did you get him to amend his own order, right? I mean, but somehow he did. So clearly they were close. And he was, clearly had spent a lot of time in his circle. And that story kind of convinced me that my grandfather wasn't naive or slow, that he was in fact actually quite smart and quite cunning, because he saved his own life. Being a guard in the prison camp in the Soviet Union was not that different from being a prisoner in that prison camp, right? Because you're still living in wooden barracks in the middle of permafrost, right? It's not that, it's not like being, a guard in a prison. It's really like living in the same kind of wasteland, the frozen wasteland with the rest of the population of the labor camp. So, Scott, I have to be honest. I mean, there are a lot of things about my grandfather's life that I will never know because, I think he chose to share with me some of the highlights or lowlights or whatever you might want to call them. But it's an interesting glimpse into that period, for sure.
Right. And I want to take this story to the rest of your family that's in Moscow and then elsewhere. One last thing with Stalin, though, I'm really curious about, because when you mentioned your grandfather had an admiration of his controlled character, but then Beria seems like a sadist. There are different types of totalitarian rulers, and some of them really do seem like sadists, like Idi Amin in Uganda, who had goon squads and torture chambers and personally used machetes to hack off limbs of people before they were gutted and killed. But then you have other totalitarians who almost have an innocence about them, and they believe that what they're doing is for a righteous cause, even though they seem on the outside evil or ridiculous, like a Sapar Murat Niyazov in Turkmenistan, who had a statue that revolved to face the sun. And in a weird way, he doesn't seem like he's a cynic. He really does seem to believe what he's doing is helping Turkmenistan. And what do you think Stalin was? Do you think he had sadistic tendencies, or in his mind, was there a way that having triggered famines and gulags and other things were really for the best of Russia and the world?
That's a really deep question. Stalin was not a zealot. He was a profoundly smart man. I mean, he was a man who was personally involved in censoring art, for example. We know that he would redline manuscripts by novelists and playwrights. He would give Eisenstein edits on his films. He was somebody who really was, he had gone to divinity school. He was not an ignoramus. He was somebody who was quite interested in culture and religion. In terms of your question, though, it's interesting. Certainly, he was a frontline Bolshevik. I mean, he was somebody who was involved in Bolshevism before the Soviet Union. He had been exiled a number of times for his activities and his acts of terrorism, as they were called then, against the Tsar. And certainly his relationship with his inner circle, with the other kind of old line Bolsheviks before 1932, when his wife dies, were certainly collegial. I mean, it's really in the early 30s, with the death of his wife, that things start to become very different, start to curdle, and the tenor of paranoia starts to overtake the Soviet government, which is not to say that things before that were in any way rosy. It's just that I think Stalin was a believer in the communist cause, but I think he was also someone whose sort of personal greed for power, whose considerable paranoia really, I think in some ways, warped his ideology. Not to say that, I mean, the ideology itself was violent from the beginning. Even in the times of Lenin and Trotsky, the Soviet Union was, a country that, used violence and used sort of what we now call acts of terrorism to achieve its goals. But I think, of course, Stalin took it to levels that were unprecedented, where, he committed, mass genocide against essentially his own people. Unlike Adolf Hitler, who, committed genocide on a mass scale against, persecuted groups, Stalin targeted mostly the citizens of the Soviet Union, which makes it kind of in a way more confounding, right? Mm-hmm. But I think, and I think trying to pull apart the strands of where his ideology ended and where his paranoia began is really difficult. I mean, it was certainly a cult of personality. He was certainly a dictator in the purest sense. He was the absolute ruler of the country. He certainly used methods that have been emulated by many other dictators to maintain power, which is, accusing members of his own government of espionage and, insurrection, of having show trials, of executing them. Certainly he understood a lot about how terror worked, about how fear worked, about instilling, this kind of climate of secrecy and terror, first on his own government and then on the entire country. I mean, the instruments of terror are essentially carried out by ordinary citizens. No government can maintain control of its citizenry all the time. And so, eventually this became the thing we call the Great Terror, and the purges was essentially carried out by ordinary citizens of the Soviet Union who, informed on their neighbors, informed sometimes on their family members, on their coworkers. He transformed the country into this kind of paranoid madhouse where people were, arrested in the night on fictional charges because they had been denounced by somebody, where, arrests were happening by quota, not due to probable cause or evidence. I mean, it's really I think Stalin is really one of the great mysteries of the 20th century. As there have been many psychological profiles of him written, some quite good. But I think teasing apart what made him tick in terms of, whether he was an ideologue or whether he was a kind of personal paranoiac or kind of a sadist, I think it's very difficult. I don't know if there's an answer to your question that would be satisfactory. I think he was a mix of the two. He wasn't purely in it for, for the sadism. He was clearly somebody who believed in the mission of communism, and in the sort of, I think he, in some ways, really believed in the Soviet project. But at the same time, he also inflicted unimaginable horror on the Soviet Union and on the people of that country that lasted for decades. So I guess I don't have a satisfactory answer for you. I think it's kind of a part of that is just the work of historical deduction. He was a complex person, you know, and probably one of the most diabolical figures in human history. So I don't know how to answer your question better than that.
Well, that is a very complicated question. So thank you for trying to do that, since it isn't really an either or with someone like Stalin. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. I'm very interested in the rest of your family because on the one hand, you have some like your grandfather who are consummate insiders, bodyguards to Stalin, and then also your grandmother who lived in Moscow and would make clothing items for Soviet ministers' wives. But then others who aren't, like your mother who helps deal with psychological trauma of dissidents and your father who's in the black market. So tell me about your family in Moscow and how they sit on this divide and their stories.
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind, Scott, is that by the time I was born, 1970, the Soviet Union was a really different country. I mean, it had become a much more, I would say, a much less extreme place to live. It was certainly still a totalitarian country. It was not a country with free elections. It was not, the government was centralized, the economy was centralized. There was no real freedom of speech or press or assembly in the way that we understand it in the West. At the same time, it was also peacetime, and it was time of what I would say can be called relative prosperity, certainly compared to kind of the famines and shortages of the first half of the 20th century. So in a way, it was kind of growing up in a much less extreme place than my grandparents had lived. My mother had grown up in Lithuania. Her parents were Jewish. My father was Vasily's son. His mother was from Moscow. So he was ethnically Russian, Ukrainian. My mother was ethnically Jewish in the Soviet Union. That made a big difference. Jews were definitely a kind of prosecuted group. And of course, in the Soviet Union, you had to, even though we were kind of a state that didn't have ethnicity or religion, in your domestic passport, which was the ID you carried with you inside the country, there was a column that said ethnicity, and Jewish was an ethnicity, not a religion. So essentially, if your passport said Jewish, you would be barred from any number of things in Soviet life, attending the college you wanted, the university you wanted, getting certain jobs, being considered for promotion, things like that. So my parents met at Moscow State University when they were 1968, when they were both college students. You know, my mother was interested in psychology. She became a psychologist at a big psychiatric hospital in Moscow. My father, who was Vasily's son, and his mother, as you mentioned, was a clothing designer who had the very enviable job of making clothes for the most powerful women in the Soviet Union, which meant a lot because the economy of the Soviet Union at that time was not an economy of cash. It was an economy of favors and influence. Money didn't buy you very much that you needed. The things that everybody really wanted and needed were always deficit things that you needed to get from somebody that were not available in stores. So the thing that really mattered in the Soviet Union, was called blat in Russian, which means pull, which means, having juice, having the ability to get rare and desirable things by virtue of either having a powerful position or being able to do favors for other people. So my father he loved movies. He got a job at the Film Institute in Moscow, but his real work was selling things on the black market. The Soviet Union had a huge and very developed black market, which means that anything from certainly anything from the West, anything from good cognac to Levi's jeans to records and books were all contraband, meaning that they were not legally imported into the country. So if you wanted those things, you had to get them privately, which means illegally. And my father knew diplomats and other people who could travel abroad who would bring him suitcases full of rock and jazz records, which is what he sold mostly. As a kid, I remember people coming to our apartment from, sometimes across town, and my father would have a John Coltrane record or, a Rolling Stones record. And I remember he would sell them to these men. It was always guys who would come with these leather bags, from and he would sell them, a record that you could buy here in a record store for